player is not the protagonists, even if you gave them a name, and even if you project yourself onto them. Or in other words, there has to be a separation between the player and protagonist, because it's the game's way of holding the player accountable for what they do in the game's world. In making this separation, the player is not able to use the protagonist as cover, and furthermore, it allows the protagonist to act and think on their own accord if need be. And, well, this is actually the easiest essential to apply to this game, given the fact that it has been handed to us on fucking several silver platters and is probably the part of the meta-narrative that's arguably the most highlighted out of anything else, in the form of the player being the soul and thus being completely separate from our protagonist, Chris. That's it. That's the separation. We could literally just cut this section short and move on to the next one because in regards to looking for a straight answer, it's painfully obvious. But, even with that answered, we can at least use this section to delve into Chris as a character in a way that I had held back on in Section 2, back when I was going over Chris's themes and backstory as a character. If you recall, I had assigned them the themes of autonomy and freedom of choice. And I did go into some depth about it then, but a lot of details regarding this theme were things that felt ultimately more applicable to this section, where it's all about that separation between them and the player. Having already gone over how those themes manifested even beyond the player's influence, now would be a good time to examine how the player does factor into this struggle for Chris to feel in control of themselves, because in that sense, it goes a lot deeper. I think to put the larger dynamic between the player and protagonist into something brief, I believe that where Undertale's separation of the two was done to focus more on holding the player accountable for the power that they have over Undertale's world, and being able to directly question the player that way, Deltarune uses this separation by instead questioning how much you are willing to project onto a protagonist. Or in other words, how much do you actually see the protagonist as their own character rather than just an extension of yourself? There's two sides to this dynamic, the player's side and Chris's side, so I'd like to go over the former first. I touched on this already, but to go back, I think this is especially something that is important to the game's themes given that the Ganar Maker even alludes to this, with the whole "of course they are the same" quote when you give both the vessel and creator the same name. Right from the jump, Deltarune needs this separation because it's calling attention to the fact that the player is so prone to just seeing themselves into protagonist with no questions about it. And Gaster knows this. It seems he even expected this from the player in a way. To the player, naming this vessel is naming Link after themselves in the older Zelda games. It's the same as naming Ness or Lucas after yourself. You wouldn't think the game would ask for your name as yourself, the actual person in reality, you just assume that the person on the screen is supposed to be you. So by having this prompt, only to then ask for the creator's name after, it's a clever subversion in my opinion for especially this early in the story. And it's not the only detail that seems to call attention to this projection onto the protagonist. Far from it, in fact. Think about how the first time you ever save, you see Chris's name, and then after that, anytime you save onto a fresh file, it just says empty instead, cementing that you made a connection to the protagonist and have left your mark on them, that no matter what, you're always projecting onto them in some way, even if you try to see them as their own character. It's the game's way of telling you that even if you do acknowledge the separation, you can't undo the necessity of having to project yourself onto Chris, or else, how would you be able to have your own input on the game to begin with? Hell, the Dark World in general is more prone to acknowledging the player over Chris, as I mentioned in the last section. I think it's even designed to intentionally draw the player into preferring it over the Light World because of how much it accommodates more for the player in comparison. Aside from the more accessible UI and characters like Ralze more blatantly acknowledging the existence of something controlling Chris and seeing it like a game, even smaller details like the rune referring to Castletown as Player Town support this. In short, the Dark World, to some extent, enables this projection, and it recognizes that it needs that projection in order for things to move forward in that world's story. Contrast this with the Light World, that seems to focus more on Chris rather than the player. The player's name never shows up in the Light World even if you manage to hack in a save point. And as far as we can tell, barring the weird route, nobody seems to even know that there's something else controlling Chris. Susie doesn't even know the player exists, and the closest that anyone can get is characters like Toriel and Noelle noticing that Chris is clearly not acting like themselves lately. But to them, that could mean literally anything, and I don't imagine that their first guess is because they're literally possessed, at least in a normal route, that is. But in general, the light world is also clearly where Chris is more in control of things, even if only by a bit. It's where they've pulled the soul out on their own accord. No one is there speaking to the player through Chris, and it's where the core of this dynamic is most blatantly demonstrated. That what the player wants is not always going to be what Chris wants, and vice versa. Some dialogue choices you get, for instance, like the end of Chapter 2. Maybe you would rather go with Noelle or Rouse, but Chris only really aligns with the player if they pick Susie for that prompt. And even in the choices where you say something that Chris doesn't want to say, sure, they do have to say it, but that doesn't mean they'll say it in the way that you might want them to. You can make Chris say that they're perfectly fine after the neophyte, and they'll say it even if it doesn't sound convincing. But when you let them say that they're not alright, they mean that shit. And if you make Chris open the door to Azrael's room in the mansion, they'll do it, but they're sure as hell not gonna let you see what's in there. And for the light world, well, we'll get to that in a bit, but that goes without much explanation. They know when to especially leave you out so that they have all the input to themselves. In the first few chapters, we can tell that they will go with the player generally, but they also know when to ensure that you won't intervene if there's something that they really want to do just on their own accord. Sure, that might mean that they'll have to throw the balance between player and protagonist against your favor if they decide to pull the soul out, but generally speaking, this is the dynamic at a somewhat balanced state. But when this balance is shifted in the other direction, well, that's where you get the weird route. Which I think in this context is exactly what happens when you ignore Chris's agency to such an extent to where you force them to function not too unlike that vessel you had made at the beginning of the game. It's representative of the player projecting way too much onto Chris in an effort to force an outcome that the player wants in the exact way that the player wants it. It's you turning Chris into any old generic RPG protagonist, and I think it's such a big reason for why the weird route feels so eerie. Deltarune puts a lot of effort into really making Chris and the Lightners feel like people. Everything has this personal touch to it, even in Chris's limited autonomy. They have some means of expressing themselves, and having the flavor text for them reflect that. The game acknowledges that it is ultimately an RPG and that Chris is being projected onto, but I imagine you're meant to initially grow attached to Chris and the other Lightners as their own characters. You're meant to eventually see them like you would see a friend of yours at the very most, rather than like toys to play with against their own will. So when you go into the weird route and you start having Chris manipulate Noelle and other characters around them for your own benefit, and you see even the flavor text reflect this, save points now just saying that you were filled with power, and the stats menu just having these bare-bones, impersonal descriptions of Chris and Noelle, it's like you're removing that very personal touch from them, and I think that's what makes it so fucking creepy for some. It's like seeing people who should be friends to you now just turn into things, objects, something with no personal or sentimental value aside from pure function, and breaking them down into only their more essential roles. And the game goes about nailing the sin by having the weird route give the player a huge advantage, because not only do they end up projecting onto Chris so much that they manipulate Noelle directly, but the player is able to actually manifest themselves into the story beyond the soul in Chris. They end up taking the form of their own voice, a terrifying voice that Noelle hears, one that persists even when Chris is downed in fights. While you and Chris do tend to be used interchangeably throughout the game, the weird route is a likely exception in this, because in the weird version of the neophyte, when Chris calls for Susie and Rousey's help, nobody comes to help, and it's specified that Chris is doing this. But when you get to Noelle, it says that you whispered Noelle's name. Your own manipulation overrides Chris's ability to call for help. It's the ultimate culmination of the weird route in Chapter 2, in that the player breaks enough bonds with the game and intended story, and even with the protagonist, in order to become so strong that they can just summon an over-leveled spellcaster in a difficult situation and instantly win as if it were nothing. It's a presence so strong that it even persists in the light world. It's so strong that it allows the player to bypass one of the unique cutscenes in the light world after the weird route just by pressing forward a few times. And it's one that actually makes Noelle really question what's happening with Chris, going from just thinking they're not acting like themselves, to now actually seeing that there's a problem and wanting to get to the bottom of it. In short, it sure as hell allows the player to project a lot more onto the game and strengthen their connection to it by a ton, at the cost of completely throwing Chris's agency to the wind, and with it throwing things off script and muffling, and even damaging in some cases, any kind of growth that characters like Noelle and Susie would otherwise go through. And, you know, actually fucking killing Birdly along the way. Because the player is treating Chris solely like a shell for the player to insert themselves into, with no respect for their own agency or any say they want to have on the matter, onto a world that sees itself as real and treats itself more like a real world rather than a fictional one, it fully nails in how important this dynamic is and how disastrous it can be if it's thrown completely off balance. And that's not even going into the whole thing I mentioned with how this route involves breaking bonds and manipulating said bonds in the player's favor. Especially if going with the theory that hyperlink blocked is actually love, there's plenty of things in the weird route that have strangely romantic implications. Saying that you'll ride the Ferris wheel with Noelle, a few of the main items for the weird route being rings that Noelle can wear and referencing and alluding to them like their wedding rings, and referring to Chris and Noelle's relationship like it's something more than just friends. Spammed in literally asking if Chris and Noelle were making love. Under this theory, it's fucking creepy, and intentionally so. Because not only are you projecting way too much onto Chris, but you're projecting your own desires onto other characters. Instead of respecting what kind of bonds Chris wants to have with Susie and Noelle, the game is calling attention to the player forcefully trying to get closer to Noelle and make her more subservient to the player, against her own will. It's toxic. Yet, if this were any other game, then this would just be how it goes. That's how relationships work with fictional characters in games, right? And here, Deltarune begs to differ in that regard. And it's not just in the weird route. If I really wanted to poke the hive a little bit, for as much as I love Rouse as a character, the scenes where him and Chris are alone, with the player still controlling them and where you're able to hug him and borderline flirt with him on occasion, kind of have their own weird implications. I don't think Rouse is literally Asriel, or that they're even going to be remotely similar characters in personality, but I can't deny that the similarities are there. No matter what way you look at it, Rouse does resemble a member of the Dreamer family. If not Asriel specifically, he sure as fuck looks like a Dreamer. And that's probably why Chris doesn't really see him as highly as they see Susie. To them, it's like seeing a weird alternate version of their brother when Asriel was younger. Not quite the same, but still clearly reminding them of him. And I imagine they probably feel a way about the player trying to flirt with and be so affectionate to Rouse through Chris. You don't want to do that to anyone in your family, obviously, and that would extend to someone who would ultimately remind you of someone from your family. It's got undertones to it. Even if not as blatantly harmful as the weird route in Noelle, I think that how the game handles the player's bonds with other characters through Chris is really notable. And I've noticed it's often one of the main ways that the dynamic between Chris and the player is highlighted, in that Chris treats these characters with some sense of reality to them in any case. Because to them, Susie and Noelle are real people. Maybe Rouse is more like a fictional character to them, but ultimately they still see something very real in him, something personal. Whereas the player doesn't feel that realness nearly as much, and it leaves them prone to treating these characters very superficially. No regard for Chris's agency or for what other characters may want, with Rouse enabling this by specifically trying to appeal to the player on several occasions because he's embracing his own fictional nature. Even when this dynamic is relatively balanced, it's a fucking mess, and on the player's end, they are capable of throwing so many things off track for Chris and other characters if they cared that little about them. It shows that this essential is so important because it forces the player to acknowledge how much they're projecting onto the protagonist versus how much they're willing to treat fictional characters like real people, like friends in a way. In order for the Lightners especially to get their way, the player has to acknowledge the agency that they're taking away from Chris and treat Chris like their own person, which for a medium where the two are often synonymous in function may be a lot to ask of some. I don't think it outright condemns the player for not treating them like real people, because some players just don't really feel that way about fictional characters, as some like Rouse may be more understanding of. And let's not forget that I do think the game is actively encouraging the player to go out of their way to break things and entertain their own curiosity. But I really think that this dynamic serves as more of a litmus test for how far you're willing to go in projecting onto Deltarune's characters. Can you treat the Lightners like real people, or do you just see them as toys to play with and impose your will upon? Because regardless of that, they are more like the former, and they have to be in order for the player to be forced to grapple with this dilemma. And I think the game has to see the Lightners like real people because I think it even goes as far as the marketing for Deltarune. Why do you think Toby doesn't want merch of the Lightners to be made, for instance? He's always been pretty mindful about how merch is handled with certain characters, making sure any official merch of Gaster isn't made. Or if so, it's then removed from future production of that merch aside from the first wave of it, and describing Kara as something that can't be bought in a store. And the Lightners feel much more real to me. They live in a substantially more mundane setting, deal with issues that may hit closer to home compared to the scale that Undertale worked with, and I think for a lot of people growing up in similar circumstances to them can be a lot more relatable as characters. And furthermore, the Darkners are to the Lightners what both of them are to us. To make much of the Lightners would ignore the realness of them as characters. We don't have the consent of these people to make such things of them compared to the Darkners, which do embrace their fictional nature and thus make sense to have merch of. In fact, having merch of them probably supports the purpose of their existence. They were made to serve Lightners and bring entertainment to them, and they know that. Especially if Deltarun's message overall is anything like what I might think it is, it might be that very connection, that personal bond to the Lightners, or even the lack thereof, that is essential in order for the game's message to work. And making merch of them not only discredits the amount of realness that they possess, but would hurt the message of the game at large. And that's just the player's end of the dynamic. It's the game's way of measuring how much you are willing to project onto the protagonist and characters surrounding them. But what about the protagonist? Because looking at ourselves alone is only going to reveal so much. What does Chris actually feel about all of this, and how does that play into this dynamic? To start, we obviously have the various ties between Chris and Spamton. As I went over before, they clearly feel some way about him, given that they're both in similar circumstances, trying to gain freedom and undo the strings, whether physical or metaphorical, that keep them bound to only function and express themselves within a certain limit. Chris is actively kind of freaked out by Spamton on multiple occasions, and it's the one instance where they're so emotionally overwhelmed that they have to raise their voice to really express how they're feeling if given the chance to do so. Whether that be because they saw him as a friend, or were scared of him, or simply just saw him as a cautionary tale, one thing can be said for certain. They're terrified of what Spamton went through, and I believe that's because if Spamton wasn't able to break his own strings, and even upon doing so was just rendered unable to function, then what does that say about Chris's struggle with such a thing? How can they achieve freedom of choice and full autonomy if helping someone else to achieve it ultimately didn't work out at all? Adding on the other things I mentioned regarding their struggle for autonomy, and I think it's safe to say that, obviously, they don't really have a lot to be fond of in their current predicament. They rebel against the player a lot depending on what the player chooses, and so any semblance of freedom they can find, they're willing to use. And furthermore, we know that even just our presence in them is enough to make characters like Toriel and Noelle question them and notice that something about them isn't quite right. But beyond that, if we want to understand Chris's role in this dynamic, I believe we have to look at what Chris has done independently of our influence. What have they accomplished while the soul wasn't in their body? At the end of Chapter 1, we get our first instance of them pulling the soul out to our knowledge. They jump out of bed, pull the soul out, throw it in the cage, and then pull a knife before smiling into the player's perspective. Aside from this likely being taken as them knowing that they're being watched, this doesn't give us much aside from, oh boy, they're about to do something devious. Which in Chapter 2 is confirmed in the form of them eating the pie that Toriel had just made, as well as plugging in the TV between chapters, which, given what happens at the end, is an especially interesting choice. And at the end of Chapter 2, they pull the saw out once after turning on the sink, and then jump out the window to slash Toriel's tires without her, Susie, or the player even knowing it. They go back in and act like everything is normal, until Toriel goes out and notices the slashed tires, which leads to her making Susie stay home, which allows them to pull the soul out yet again, open the door, turn on the TV, and create a dark fountain of their own. Currently, this is the extent to what they've done without the soul in them in the game's events. And the most notable thing to me, beyond them making their own fountain, is that they had plugged in the TV between chapters 1 and 2. Which may imply that they had been planning on having a dark fountain be made in the Dreamer home before Chapter 2 had even happened, and may have even planned on Susie staying over for this event. With what little we've seen them do, this all tells me at least one thing. Whatever Chris wanted to do seemed premeditated, prepared, planned out with some level of thoroughness. They didn't just pull the soul out of their ass, this was weirdly calculated. Maybe not fully, but to some extent they had been wanting to make a dark world before the Queen even gave her whole speech about how fountains are formed in the first place through determination. So, they might have experience with dark worlds, or at least learned on their own that it was possible to make one. That is, if we wanted to reach a bit there, but that's about as much as we can take away from what they've done without the soul, in-game at least. Of course, there are other things of note, like the blog posts where we can assume they're the only other real peeks we have at how Chris is like without our influence. Especially in the Chris Dreamer Chris blog post, where, as I said before, they display behavior that suggests that there's something about being at Noelle's house that often reminds them of something, and leaves them lost in thought, leading them to play the piano for a while as a result. And of course, I've gone over their character overall, so I won't retread old ground here. But there is one thing that I did leave out. Or, well, a few things, but it all culminates into what I believe is one huge discrepancy regarding Chris and the soul. We've been assuming this whole time that our control over Chris started right as Toriel woke them up in Chapter 1. After all, that's when our connection to Chris was officially established from our point of view. We weren't controlling them at any point before, especially because clearly, if we were, then Toriel and Noelle wouldn't be saying that Chris is acting or looking unlike themselves. But if that's the case, why have they had a wagon with a birdcage on it just sitting in the corner of the room for who knows how long, which, as far as we know, has only been used to store the soul in it, but is said to have already seen some crashes? Sure, we could try to assume that maybe they had a pet bird or something, but we don't know that. You'd think if that were the case, someone in Hometown or even Toriel would have already mentioned it, and yet there's nothing implying that in the game at all. And what about this bit in Chapter 2, where while Chris is away slashing Toriel's tires and Susie's asking what's taking them so long, Toriel just says that Chris does this sometimes, as if this isn't the first time Chris has just left the sink on for a while, as if maybe they've pulled the soul out before the events of the game? Has Chris been doing this before our involvement? Because with what few implications there are, it's certainly starting to sound like that to me. We have no other reason for the birdcage to be in Chris's room that we know of, and it's implied to have already seen some use, along with the stain next to it probably being some proof of that if you want to reach a bit. And given what we know Chris has done while leaving the sink on in the bathroom, we don't really have a frame of reference for what else they could be doing in that situation. Albeit, Toriel could just be referring to Chris messing around in there in general rather than specifically leaving the sink on, but even if we examine the birdcage by itself, this thing's existence has no other purpose to us beyond storing the soul. I imagine that if it had any other purpose, it would have already been mentioned by now, and furthermore, you'd think it wouldn't just be sitting in Chris's room unless they have a reason for it to be there other than sentimental value. What other reason could Chris have to have a birdcage in their room if not to store the soul in it? With all of this in mind, I feel I have to make the conclusion currently that, yes, Chris must have been using this birdcage to store the soul even before our involvement and influence on them in the game itself. Which of course leads into the next question, why? If there's no other force controlling the soul before our involvement, as far as we know at least, then why would they still be pulling it out at all? What reason do they have to throw their own soul out even if we're not controlling it? And to that, well, I'm gonna be real with you, I don't fucking know. Seriously, I don't know. It's been over a year since I started working on this series, and this is a rare case where I don't even think I have an educated guess that sounds good enough. It feels paradoxical and makes no sense, but this birdcage's existence can't be justified in any other way for me. And I feel that so far there's only evidence leaning towards them having done this to their soul before our involvement. You could argue that the flavor text regarding it could just be referring to something more mundane, like it seeing a lot of crashes outdoors rather than in the room, or maybe it having had a pet in it at some point that escaped or passed, but again, its constant presence in this room suggests that Chris has had a reason to use this wagon and cage recently enough that they've been using it for the soul specifically before we began controlling it. And we could make the argument that maybe there was some other force controlling the soul before us, but that just sounds rather contrived to me and like it would only complicate things further. But I'm fixated on this birdcage because I'm certain that this one object may be instrumental to understanding Chris as a character. I just feel that it's a case of retroactive foreshadowing currently, because for some reason, I am sure that this birdcage has to be extremely important to the story and it will have more light shed on it eventually, but that it just hasn't gotten to that point yet in the narrative where it's relevant. I think it will become a thing where it'll seem super obvious why Chris has always had this cage around or what it really means, but only if you already have the context for it from much later in the game, which we obviously don't have. But what we do have are themes and potential symbolism. The birdcage, as a symbol, in relation to Chris's themes of autonomy and freedom of choice, I feel should go without saying. It is Chris's way of turning that lack of agency that they've struggled with back onto us, rejecting the force that's keeping them from being themselves and limiting it in a form of retaliation. Once it's closed, there's no escape. But of course, this gets more difficult when thinking about why they would pull the soul out before our involvement. And it's still something that I feel we just don't have all the pieces for yet, but I do think the community has actually gotten pretty close. I'd like to use this bit to go over a couple of theories that I saw related to the birdcage and Chris pulling the soul out in general that I think fit in shockingly well with the birdcage's potential importance. There's a video by Shadow of Roserade regarding how knives in Undertale and Deltarune are used thematically and the such, and I heavily recommend you go check it out anyway. Their videos and coverage on the games are very thorough and well-researched. But a theory about it that I think relates quite a bit to this is how one could take things like pulling out the soul and even the use of knives as stuff that could have some self-harm implications. As they point out in this analysis, every instance of Chris removing the soul has Chris's knife involved. They pull it out as a further means to show defiance to the player. They use it to cut up and eat the pie. They use the knife to slash Toriel's tires. And of course, they use it to open a dark fountain. The knife could act as something of a companion thematically to Chris removing the soul, and again, their video goes over the deeper implications of this in great detail. But I specifically want to focus on the self-harm implications. I feel it probably goes without saying how the imagery of knives connects to that, but when applying it to what Chris does with the soul, it makes me look at it in a very interesting light. What Chris does with the soul looks painful. The damage sound even plays repeatedly every time they do it, and they clearly have to endure some pain in order to remove the soul in the first place. I suppose if you were to gauge any real reason for why they may have been removing it before our involvement, it may have been an act of self-harm. Although, that by itself wouldn't really explain anything and it only adds more questions. We have the reason, but what warrants that reason exactly? That's where it still gets rather hazy, until we try to take a deeper look at what exactly the soul really means to Chris, and what it means in general in Deltarune's world. A soul, as we know it in the lore between both games, is known to be a culmination of one's being. It is how someone can exist beyond their physical form. By this definition, Chris's soul should be the culmination of their being. It should be what makes them truly themselves. And so I feel that in throwing the soul out of their own body, with or without the player's influence, it becomes not just an act of removing the soul and harming themselves, but rejecting their own self. Rejecting what makes Chris, Chris. Perhaps out of a self-hatred for some aspects of themselves, a self-consciousness for what makes them othered by people in hometown, or feeling like an outcast or not as accomplished as someone like Asriel or the Dreamer family in general. We have to think about Chris's circumstances before the player was even involved. We know they feel a certain way about their place in the family and in hometown, and they clearly seem uncomfortable in their own skin. They don't like seeing other humans. They've expressed some desire to be a monster like the other Dreamers, and yet they can't. That much, they are unable to choose for themselves. To that end, they can't achieve the autonomy that they may ultimately want, only approximations of it, a headband where their horns should be. And as far as we know, the other Lightners, or particularly the monsters, don't really have souls in the way that Chris does. They may have something like monster souls, but regardless, it's not the one that Chris has. And if that's the case especially, then there's no better symbol for what Chris wants to reject than the soul itself. There's no better choice for what you'd rather remove if you hate the very culmination of what makes you the person that you are. And furthermore, you may conclude that if this culmination is what's limited you and kept you from what you really want to be, that you'd retaliate by putting that very culmination in a cage, the way that you feel it's kept you in one for your whole life. The only guess I can give for why the birdcage may have been there and may have been used for the soul before our involvement is that even if the player wasn't limiting their agency before that point, to Chris, that wouldn't even have mattered. You can't be happy with your soul if you feel it's the reason that you can't make the changes that you want to make in your life. To that end, that is what I think the birdcage represents, and while I'm lacking the exact context behind it and what role it may play in the story, if any, I feel that's about as good as I'm gonna get in analyzing the why of it and its relevance to Chris and the player. Which, speaking of, this is all keeping in mind Chris before the player's involvement. I'd like to bring in the second video related to this topic that I think is also excellently done in a really good, even if pretty esoteric watch by Wire Girl about the body without organs and how that applies to Deltarune. I especially recommend watching it if you're interested in a more in-depth look at it because there is no way that I'm going to be able to succinctly summarize what that video goes over and what a body without organs is in its full capacity. But to give a super general explanation that just applies to Deltarune, their video goes over how Chris pulling out the soul draws a lot of parallels to the idea of being a body without organs. To explain this incredibly simply, imagine that in any given thing there are parts, and the interaction of those parts between each other make up a body. a whole of some kind. However, a body often only allows those parts to interact with each other in one specific way, yet despite that, there is always an underlying potential for that to change. That potential for change, and for those parts to operate in every other way imaginable, is the so-called body without organs, a state of infinite possibilities. To apply this philosophy to Deltarune, the body is hometown itself and the people in it. It's the unchanging nature of small towns, how, despite them being often very tight-knit, nothing really new happens. All the places are the same, the politics are the same, the people are the same, and Chris's routine in this town is the same. It's all very stagnant, especially before the player's involvement. Taking what I said about their discontent for the soul, their inability to achieve the freedom of choice that they desire is another facet of this. They can't choose who they are in this world, and are stuck with the soul as is. But then comes the player, and the Dark Worlds, and suddenly, everything is now thrown out of whack. Chris and Hometown achieve that state of infinite possibilities of being a body without organs as a result of the player's introduction. Things are now happening, and things are suddenly different from the norm and are beginning to change rapidly. Becoming a body without organs in this case is a process of recognizing the motions you've been used to going through and allowing yourself to embrace going through different motions altogether. When we look at how this applies to Chris, aside from them literally removing an organ from their body, we now see their actions in a new light potentially. Aside from the implications of rejecting and not being content with oneself, Chris removing the soul is a way of rejecting the norm. Chris doesn't want to just go to bed now and sleep through the night, now they want to break out of that routine and make some changes. But they also know their boundaries. You don't make changes violently and with aggression, you make them with care. It's good to go out of your way to change your circumstances and routine to shake things up a bit, but in entering that state of constant flux and rapid change, it's sort of like hitting the gas pedal a little harder than usual. There's a thrill to it, and it may even feel cathartic, but leave the foot on the pedal for too long and you might not be able to slow back down before you crash altogether. You don't throw all of your prior ways to the wind, you just add a couple of new factors to keep things fresh and to avoid stagnancy. Every time Chris pulls out the soul, it's all calculated because they only need to do enough to spice things up for the next day. It can't be permanent, or else, well, at least for Chris, they may just literally crash and lose their own life. By throwing away the beating heart, the body can only continue to function for a short time, even if that time allows you to do literally whatever you want in this case. And of course, bringing us back down to earth here, we also just don't know what really happens if someone goes without a soul for too long. However, I get the feeling that there will be a lore reason for specifically why Chris can't just throw the soul out for good and be done with it. And if so, then I believe it'll only support this notion further. And it's not just Chris that participates in this activity of removing themselves from the norm. On the player's end, their very existence rejects the norm. The second that they enter Chris, people start to notice that things are different with them, and things in the town suddenly start developing more rapidly because of your presence generally. And I believe this relates very closely to what I mentioned regarding Deltarune's themes of nostalgia and curiosity and how secrets are a part of the game's core themes. You are encouraged, in my opinion, to go off the main route to find these secrets. Being in a state of instability and rapid change isn't this inherently bad thing, it's something that the game wants to draw out of you. It wants you to dig beyond the surface. But of course, when it's taken too far for the player, that's when you get something like the weird route. Derailing from the norm so hard that it delves further into the negative potential and things that can harm Chris and those around them. So, looking at the player-protagonist dynamic with all of this considered, I believe both of them are dancing the same dance, but in different ways. The player does have to acknowledge that they are projecting onto the protagonist and that they are taking away some of the protagonist's agency in favor of their own by connecting to Deltarune's world. And it can be abused to make something like the weird route happen, where they reduce these characters with their own lives and personalities and feelings into nothing but toys and roles. But on the flip side, we have a protagonist who, as a character, is already in a state where they feel stuck, in a place where it seems like nothing is changing ever and they can't achieve the freedom that they want. So they reject themselves by putting their own soul in a cage, like they feel it's done for them. It's the only thing they feel they have control over, where everything else seems to be spiraling out of it. But because of the player now getting involved, while it is still limiting them, it's now evoking more rapid changes and shaking things up a bit, both through the player's influence and Chris's own changes here and there upon removing the soul to prevent this intervention when they really want to do something on their own accord. Both the player and protagonist are participating in rejecting the norm and going off the beaten path, and while the protagonist may not fully align with the player, and said player similarly may not like being locked out of certain situations via cutscenes and made unable to see certain things, they weirdly enough kind of need each other in this story. It's through the player's inputs, aside from the Dark Worlds themselves, that things are now becoming more interesting. But it's thanks to Chris and them allowing us to control them that we have a connection to Deltarune and can suspend our disbelief at all. There is a balance to this dynamic, one that can become catastrophically thrown out of whack, but a needed balance regardless. Which, with all of that said, begs one last question. One last little discrepancy that I think will put a nice bow on this section. We've established how Chris is removing the soul as a means of making their own changes so that the current situation can be steered more in their favor, breaking away from the norm in order to get closer to what they actually desire. But we've also established how the player can easily abuse their part of the dynamic by projecting way too much onto Chris in the Dark World and making the weird route happen. We know well that the Dark World does appeal more to the player and is designed with the player's control in mind compared to the Light World. So, with all of that said, why in the actual fuck does Chris still open a dark fountain at the end of the weird route? Well, I do actually have a potential answer to this, but it's more of a guess and my own personal prediction that plays into why the player and Chris even need each other in the first place. The player will have their own motive for playing Deltarune, whether it be just to escape to another world through suspension of disbelief, or connect with the characters, or just to have fun in some other way. The player's motive is up for them to decide, but ultimately it's to explore Deltarune, and if we wanted something of a more firm motive, creating a new future. But what about Chris? This whole time I've been talking about them, I've never really given a moment to shed light on why Chris is even doing what they do. Why do they plug in the TV between chapters? Why do they need Susie along with them at the end of chapter 2? Why exactly are they opening a dark fountain at all? This action feels so strange, especially at the end of a weird route if you're assuming that the reason for them making a dark world is because they just want to go on another fun adventure with their best friend or whatever. And you could say that maybe the weird route just recontextualizes this ending so that their reason for making the fountain is actually different between routes. But I have an even more straightforward guess. I think that the ending to Chapter 2 is the exact same in both routes because the motive for Chris opening the fountain and really doing what they do without the soul is also the same between routes. Their reason for it doesn't change whether or not you're doing a normal or a weird route. And even if the player does something as awful as a weird route, the ending doesn't change because regardless of that, they still need the player for something. What I'm implying here is that their reason for opening a fountain is more important to them than anything that the player may do in Deltarune. It's not to say that they don't feel bad about the weird route, of course they do. But what I'm getting at is that their reason for going back to the Dark World is much more personal and specific, and it's to achieve something that Chris can't just do on their own. You remember how I mentioned that I don't believe Chris has 3 save slots, and how that just wouldn't make sense because if they did have that much power, then why would they need the player at all? Think about what the player is capable of doing, especially when factoring in the device theory and the program being a tangible object in the game's larger world. The player has 3 slots. They can hop between any of them. Their existence can persist and revitalize itself even on a game over. They are able to experiment with Deltarune and shuffle things around to their will, for better or worse, and on top of all of that, they are able to do so through a program that can be taken apart and examined more closely to find things that Chris wouldn't be able to find otherwise. Chris isn't so capable of just fucking around and doing whatever they want in their world, but because we exist beyond their reality, and because the program itself and saving among many other things are diegetic to the game, we do have that potential to just hop out of the Deltarune experience and jump back in to any point, to any of these 3 slots. Our ability to do all of this is a huge incentive for Chris putting up with whatever we do, because we can gauge every possible outcome when they potentially can't. And furthermore, we can see things that perhaps Chris can't see. Now, with that in mind, what could possibly be more important to Chris than the things currently happening around them? What reason could there be to open a dark fountain, even if it risks allowing the player to manipulate their friends and family and use them like a puppet on strings? Well, I think I know one thing that might fit the bill. Something that they probably think will undo a catalyst that they believed led to their life going to shit ever since. and it just so happens to align rather closely with the player's sentiment about the game at large. Much like how the player may be intent on finding a different ending, or going as far out as possible to look for secrets and mysteries in Deltarune. Regardless of how deep into escapism it may take them, I think that Chris is trying to find Des. And in both cases, it's at any cost. We're about to get into the real out there shit now. But before we do, let's recap this section, as we've not only easily answered how the player and protagonist are separate in Deltarune, but we've been able to surgically dissect exactly how that separation is being used in the meta-narrative. Chris and the Soul, aka the player, are two different characters, and in meta sense, this separation is being used in Deltarune as a sort of litmus test for how much the player is willing to project onto Chris as a character, versus allowing them to exist as their own real person alongside the other Lightners, treating them more like people compared to the Darkners being treated more like fictional characters. The Weird Route is an instance of this dynamic being imbalanced severely in the player's favor, manifesting them as a terrifying voice to those subservient to it, and in general, the Dark World is more accommodating to the player's need to project onto the game, where the Light World rejects it. And on Chris's side of the dynamic, they keep the player locked out of certain events in order to make sure that some things go a very specific way without the player's interference, while otherwise still allowing the player to control them. As even with Chris's disdain for the Soul aside, both of them need each other in order to get closer to what they want to achieve in Deltarune. Chris needs the player in order to function and be guided closer to their goal using the player's greater abilities thanks to the program or device that connects them to the game's world, while the player needs Chris in order to have a vessel to connect to Deltarune with at all and explore the game efficiently. While they may not always align, they both seek to evoke more rapid changes of the game and break from the beaten path to find something more important than just reaching the end. Finding Des, and in that, perhaps even a new future, and something different from the one ending Deltarune claims to have. But with all of that said, that just leaves us with our last essential to apply to Deltarune. We've gone over everything that I deem to be diegetic to the game, and we've gone over why the player and protagonist separation is so important to Deltarune specifically. And in both cases, to some extent, I think I've been able to show how the device theory supports the conclusions I've made for these two essentials. Now, to find our last cornerstone of the game's meta-narrative and message, I want to bring us back to the second section of this video, actually, back when I was discussing this game's themes. As I established before, the game's themes all orbit around escapism and interacting with fiction, and with that, I was able to identify three specific branches from that core: autonomy, compassion, and nostalgia, each embodied by Chris, Susie, and Noelle respectively. Up until now, I had been able to more or less leave it at that. But now that we're getting up to the last section, I must admit that I have been leaving one portion of this diagram out, for it only felt appropriate to mention in this next section. One more thematic branch that I think is just as important, and perhaps is the piece we need to finally complete the closest picture we can possibly paint for Deltarune's meta-narrative and message. Freedom and the illusion of. Represented by none other than the man himself. Let's go over why Flowey was to Undertale what Gaster is to Deltarune. There is at least one character in the game with a particularly strong and direct connection to the player as the embodiment of the game's themes on a meta level. In other words, this last essential focuses on the fact that in any case, you have to answer to someone in Deltarune, and I believe that at the very least, that someone is Gaster. Since this doubles as an examination of how Gaster applies to this last essential, and an examination of Gaster's relevance to Deltarune's themes, this one's gonna get especially loaded, and there's a lot to tackle. What I hope to achieve with everything we've analyzed is building a cohesive enough profile of Gaster's character that we can actually work with in order to see where Deltarune's meta-narrative may be headed. I believe that the more on the mark we are about Gaster as a character, especially in regards to his motivations, the more on the mark we'll also be about this game's message. So, to start, we should quickly go over what exactly we've learned about him with some level of certainty. In Undertale, we learned that Gaster was Asgore's former real scientist before Alphys, who was responsible for making the core. And at that, he was a brilliant mind and seems to generally be very passionate, curious, and committed to the bit of science itself. We know back then that he had also worked with 2 associates during his time as the real scientist, but we still don't know exactly who those associates are. As for his experiments in specific, we can assume that he was also tasked with breaking the barriers similar to Alphys, but his experiments ultimately seem to focus more on the nature and creation of Dark Worlds, as Entry 17 suggests. And at some point, those experiments with Dark Worlds went wrong, as he fell into his creation, which I'll be taking a small leap of logic here and say that he didn't fall into the core necessarily, but rather into a dark fountain, and may have not been able to find a way back out, to keep things general. In short, I think that he fucked around with darkness way too much and found out way too late, where I assume he was ejected from Undertale's world and sent to what I'd describe as a space between worlds. Not necessarily a void, as we don't exactly have a confirmed concept of that sort between the games, but given his connections to both games and the imagery of him existing in between spaces generally, it seems apt enough to call it a space between worlds for the purpose of this series at least. Nonetheless, this fall led to him shattering across time and space and turning into what we know him to be now. Someone who was a little too curious about Dark Worlds and ended up shattering himself into a presence that I believe is everywhere and yet nowhere. Someone that appears to have no consistent physical form, but is always aware and listening from afar. That is the extent to his actual lore in Undertale alone, but along with that, it also gave us a lot of calling cards that we've been able to use to identify him with in both games. For instance, his usage of wingdings, or otherwise speaking in all caps and fragmented sentences, never being mentioned by name but just as him or a man of some sort. A strong association with the number 6, repeating phrases and quotes of him, such as dark, darker, yet darker, or very, very interesting. A general association with hands for whatever reason, Gaster's theme at Smile.OTG, and as we'll touch on later, thanks to the nature of discoveries involving him in Undertale, a strong association with glitch and secret hunting, and generally the art of exploiting a game and looking, or being, where you're not supposed to. If you wanted to also do a bit of reaching, the fun events themselves, aside from the Mystery Man obviously giving us a potential clue as to his appearance, may also give us some pointers to his character. The Goner Kid may be a reflection of how Gaster feels about his predicament, for instance, so maybe he feels a bit bummed about the whole situation. Or, the Clam Girl fun event could be a pointer to Gaster's interest in Susie, which is corroborated by the Goner Maker in Deltarune. And the sound test room, what with it mentioning feedback at the end, could imply that the fun events were a way for Gaster to see if the player was interested in reaching out to him at all. Oh yeah, and several of these events also involve phone calls, the most notable one being the Wrong Number song where the person calling is looking for someone whose name starts with a G, but we can't get much more out of it aside from that. Regardless, that is about all we can really gauge of him in Undertale solely. However, to touch more on his association with glitches and secrets in particular, this is especially important because of how closely it's tied to Deltarune's themes. The fun events themselves are meant to be extremely secretive. Learning about Gaster in Undertale is something you either just happen to stumble upon by pure chance, or something that you have to go well out of your way to look for. In any case, he is heavily associated with going off the beaten path, which I've shown already is something that is instrumental to Deltarune's meta-narrative. And in fact, beyond even the stuff in the playable game, he has a pretty strong association with data mining and file manipulation in general. You can't access Entry 17, for example, through normal play, and yet it's one of the few unused rooms that isn't blocked by dogcheck. And it's probably the closest we'll ever have right now to a real peek at Gaster before he shattered. Gaster, by all means, is a character that we know of almost entirely through poking around where we aren't supposed to. This is important because while I was initially extremely picky about connecting things to Gaster and Deltarune, it's become only more clear in my analysis of this game that there is plenty of good reason to connect even the less obviously related secrets in Deltarune to him. As I mentioned in the corrections for Part 1, while I might not know the exact extent yet to some of the connections that some things have to Gaster, for instance, the secret bosses maybe didn't directly get into contact with him but with some other character that serves him, or maybe Smile.OGG is just referencing Dark Worlds in general and not Gaster specifically, the fact regardless is that the connections do exist. His presence is clearly felt regardless of how many proxies there are in some of those connections. Gaster clearly had something to do with the secret bosses, and he clearly was closely related to the Dark Worlds. This is to say, any connection to him is worth considering, and as long as it involves something about Entry 17, or the concept of darkness, or even just the concept of hands and men, you can damn bet that thing has some Gaster DNA in it as well. Which, with all of that established, allows us to start moving into his character and connections in Deltarune. We'll get the obvious connections out of the way first. As we know already, Entry 17 pretty much was just foreshadowing for Deltarune and for Dark Worlds in general. Gaster spends the majority of it just describing the nature of them and refers to an experiment regarding them. In fact, it's even directly quoted in the first version we have of him.png from the Deltarune website, the same image that would then change to quote the legend. We'll get back to that in a bit. But specifically, dark, darker, yet darker pops up more than once in regards to Deltarune. Sham quotes it explicitly after you defeat Jevil, and the chair page from the sweepstakes also potentially alludes to the concept of making a fountain within a dark world, by asking if we could get darker than dark. And furthermore, smile.ogg, the sound that plays during Entry 17, is used in Deltarune multiple times, mainly when using the cell phone in the dark world, and also used and slowed down by a fuck ton when you're near Chekhov's bunker. Plus, it's even referenced as garbage noise in Chapter 2 specifically, which is the same term used to describe what one of the Addisons heard from Spamton's phone after going to check on him on the day of his eviction. So, with all of these connections, this already paints an incredibly interesting picture for Gaster, as the main thing we can take away with these more immediate connections is how closely he seems to be related to not just the Dark Worlds, but the secret bosses and Sham. It's worth pointing out the common themes and parallels between each of these three characters. Through some way or another, they've all been influenced by Gaster, with their worldviews irreversibly altered after coming into contact with him, which adds on to their nature of feeling very out of place compared to the rest of the characters and having to go so out of your way to learn more about them. As Sham even puts it, they feel as if neither light nor dark hold a future for a darkener in their condition. Whatever it is that they learn from that influence, it makes them see things that make even the more pressing and important parts of the game's story feel trivial, meaningless by comparison. Sham becomes fully nihilistic. Jevil sees himself as the only free one, the only one that's truly outside of everything. And Spamton, well, he's desperate to grab at any chance for freedom that he can, and his way of manifesting the incomprehensible shit that he saw is a conveniently blocked hyperlink that omits the thing he's desiring most. Now, honestly, there's no way of really being able to tell what the fuck hyperlink blocked actually means without speculation. Clearly, it's referring to something specific, but there's been a billion different interpretations of it. However, for the purpose of this series, I personally think it's most likely that hyperlink blocked is referring to love. It's the only interpretation of it I've seen that seems to fit each instance of it the most, and given the implications that love clearly had in Undertale, I could think of reasons why love of all things would be worth censoring, especially when you think about the fact that he does enable the player and Noelle to keep getting stronger in the weird route, and do this game's equivalent of becoming stronger as a result of breaking bonds and distancing yourself from any emotional attachment to the game's world and characters. I doubt that this is something I can really work with in any case, and I obviously could be very wrong. For all I know, it's maybe actually referring to fear, or hate, or some other kind of special hell. But it feels worth having some answer for, because regardless, Gaster's influence on Spamton was so potent that he not only knows of a concept that is currently being censored by the powers that be, but he even was close to saying something about the night before getting cut off and I guess having the night completely erased from his memory if the Q&A was anything to go off of. That, and with Unused also speaking through him, he is a whole can of worms. So much so that if my theory about Gaster intervening during the Neo fight is true, then it makes Spamton a case where Gaster had to give the player an advantage in order to keep Spamton from going too far out of line. But aside from that, when looking at all three of these characters, I feel they each embody a different facet of this theme of freedom, and as I put it, the illusion of. Jevil and Spamton especially feel like they're on opposite ends of a spectrum. Jevil being on the end of accepting whatever he had learned about his reality and declaring freedom in that he can do anything, in the wake of realizing the sheer lack thereof. In essence, nothing matters, so I can do whatever I want. Whereas Spamton obviously doesn't quite feel that way. He feels robbed of freedom. It's something that he has to attain by any means necessary. He won't accept what he's learned about his world or accept his circumstances in general. He wants to defy fate itself and reach for heaven, and become as powerful, if not even more so, than the Lighteners or even the player. And Sham completely rejects the idea of freedom. They fully accepted the futility of defying fate and would rather just sit back and watch it all happen with no worry. They're a somewhat muted Jevil in that regard. Not maniacal, but just accepting that this is how things are. While they don't tell us a lot about Gaster directly, what they each learn from him all seem to line up with this theme of grappling with the idea of finding freedom, or perhaps seeing it as only an illusion, and this is something that's going to only pop up more as we keep looking at the game through the Gaster lens. And continuing on, each of these characters also obviously share the trait of knowing way too much about how Deltarune works. As I've touched on already, they each have their ways of either breaking almost outside the bounds of the game itself, or acknowledging the boundaries at least, which is just as notable. Sham remembers your fights with secret bosses on different save files. Jevil directly mentions future events in the game. And while his dialogue about being the only free one could be just taken as him being insane or commenting on his playful nihilism, it may also be a way of him acknowledging the fact that he's one of the only Darkners who sees beyond what the other Darkners see. He's free in that he knows that the program layer, or the space between worlds, exists. And Spamton is unusually aware of the soul and its potential, and I'd say both him and Jevil seem more aware of what things look like on the player's end in general. So, whatever Gaster did or said to them made them more aware of things on a meta level. Which leads us into the fourth character that I feel fits into this group, Rouse, who I've already gone over ad nauseum in regards to meta shit. He has a heightened awareness of how things look like on the player's end, and player controls in general, seems to refer to the player more than he refers to Chris, and in context with the meta-narrative, as I've gone over, I feel he represents a personification of being very concerned about the player's experience, which may explain a lot of the changes to especially the Dark World UI between chapters. And I believe this ends up causing a very interesting revelation with the slightest bit of evidence supporting it. The common thread between Sham, Spamton, and Jevil is that they were all influenced by Gaster, and that's what led to them becoming more self-aware and cognizant of things on the player's end. And Rouse, I'd argue, is the most cognizant of things on the player's end. Even if risking confirmation bias, this bit of info, along with the fact that Gaster quoted the prophecy in Wingdings on the Deltarune website, and the fact that Rouse's wording about the prophecy refers to it being told across time and space, echoing how Gaster's shattering was described, I think it's clear the kind of connection that can be made here. I believe Gaster must have spoken to Rouse at some point too, or at least influenced him significantly. Now obviously, I don't know through what means, but when you look at how both Gaster and Rouse take great interest in Chris and Susie especially, and how Rouse is focusing on the player, it's like he's a guide of sorts that Gaster employed to assist the player over the course of the game. And I don't know about you, but I just can't think of another explanation for Rouse's increased self-awareness that would make any more sense than this just based on lore alone. It explains why he knows what he does, it explains his focus on the player at all times, and it may even explain why he shrugs off what happens with Spamton. He knows what Sham and the secret bosses know, but he isn't affected by it in a way that would put Chris and Susie at any harm, or would otherwise just leave him completely nihilistic. Plus, it explains this tone that he has at times. This tone that sounds like he has a vague idea of what's going to happen later down the line that he just hasn't opened up about yet. And in relation to themes, while he isn't explicitly focused on freedom, he does tangentially tie into it by being the person responsible for keeping things on rails. He's in a way the antithesis to the secret bosses in that he'd rather just focus on what is most important, sealing the fountains and going along with the prophecy. And even then, he does say that he thinks the player's choices do matter. He does advocate for freedom, even if he'd rather the player focus on recruiting the Darkners and treating them all with kindness. However, with that said, if I'm able to say with some confidence that Gaster has influenced all four of these characters and that they each do relate to the game's theme of freedom in some way or another, then we need to have an answer to one specific question. How did he influence them? What exactly did Gaster do or say to them that altered their worldview in such a dramatic way? In other words, for the secret bosses especially, what made them go mad? Because surely they each had to learn something incredibly substantial and earth-shattering to warrant it, and if it's something that affects every secret boss in the game and every character of that sort, you'd think there would have to be an answer to this. And the thing is, I don't think it's as simple as Gaster just going up to them and telling them that it's all actually fake, or a simulation and that they're living in a video game and nothing matters. If I were to come up to you and tell you that everything is a simulation, or fake, or that you're living in some kind of computer, maybe you'd ponder on the idea, but it wouldn't make you go mad, probably. I imagine that thinking about it alone wouldn't warrant such a severe shift in view. If we want to understand what it is that made them go mad, we have to look at what madness in this context really means. And of all things, a fucking Tumblr post I think nails this concept and applies very well to what I think happened to them. And I'd like to read it out for you, originally written by user Bramblesand. An ant doesn't start babbling when they see a circuit board. They find it strange. To them, it is a landscape of strange angles and humming monoliths. They may be scared, but that is not madness. Madness comes when the ant, for a moment, can see as a human does. It understands those markings are words, symbols with meaning, like a pheromone but infinitely more complex. It can travel unimaginable distances to lands unlike anything it has seen before. It knows of mirth, embarrassment, love, concepts unimaginable before this moment, and then it's an ant again. Echoes of things it cannot comprehend swirl around its mind. It cannot make use of this knowledge, but it still remembers. How is it supposed to return to its life? The more the ant saw, the harder it is for it to forget. It needs to see it again, understand again. It will do anything to show others, to show itself. Nothing else in this tiny world matters. This is madness. I don't know what Gaster might have said exactly to Spamton and Jevel, or even Rouse, but what I do know is that, at least in Spamton and Jevel's cases, I believe he must have made them see things the way that Gaster does. Going back to the device theory, Gaster exists outside of the light and dark worlds. To him, everything within both worlds are fictional, and he is the only real thing in the program, even if he knows that a player exists. I feel that to make a Darkener see things the way that Gaster does means to show them that they just are fictional. Where they otherwise would play along with the game, and where maybe the Darkeners don't fully understand how things in the light world work, they can at least just shrug it off. They don't need to understand beyond what they know, because to them, the dark world is all that matters. It's real enough to them, and they happily play their role. But if you show a Darkener that those weird mechanics and rules all actually have meaning and that there's programming behind everything that they're doing, not just telling them that it's all in a script, but making them see the script the way that Gaster does, now that's gonna fuck with them pretty good. If you've spent your whole existence up to that point only seeing things in 2 dimensions, and then get to see in 3 dimensions, only to have that third one stripped away from you, knowing that you're never going to have access to that 3rd dimension, and therefore knowing that you are forever limited in some fundamental way, how are you ever going to make peace with that? That's what these characters are going through. That's what makes them become so severely affected by Gaster, because Gaster literally just sees more than the characters of Deltarune could possibly imagine on their own. With Rouse, to be fair, this can be a little more open. Rouse might not have actually seen the code the way that the secret bosses have, and perhaps that's why he's not going insane. Because he was simply told about it, not shown the code itself. It's why he may only have a prophecy and some general ideas of some lore to go off of. I don't think he has the actual full script given to him by Gaster. He just has an outline of how the journey is supposed to go, to account for why he gets so surprised when he doesn't see the Susie and Noelle cutscene happen in the weird route. And I think there's not many better ways in general to make someone go insane than to show them the user interface of the world that they thought was real this whole time. To prove that something is connecting to them through a program that is from a reality beyond their understanding. And let me reiterate, this is not a theory claiming that Gaster is simulating the entirety of Deltarune and that this is all his doing. This theory is just saying that Gaster's showing the secret bosses a taste of what he had to learn when that experiment of his went so horribly wrong. I believe that in the timeline, after he shattered, something must have ensnared him about Deltarune's world so much that he wanted to reach out to characters like Spamton and Jevel and show them what he sees, or even try to give them an advantage only for it to not work out. And that on top of that, he told Rouse about what he sees, and that a player exists, and that there is a prophecy that must be carried out. For what reason exactly he did all of that, I don't know yet. But that's why we still have quite a few things left to go over before we can make any real conclusions. In fact, there is one more thing I need to touch on relating to the secret bosses before we move on from them. One thing that, sort of like the birdcage, has left me puzzled. And that's the shadow crystals. So far, you can get 2 of them, one for each chapter, and their overall purpose is very debated. We know Jevil must have gone 1 at some point after interacting with Gaster, but we also know that Spamton didn't immediately have a Shadow Crystal. At least, not until he became Spamton Neo, which could leave us to conclude that the Shadow Crystal was in the abandoned Neo body, a detail that I feel will be important to keep in mind. In any case though, we can assume that each secret boss will give us a Shadow Crystal. Sham also takes great note of them and seems to put a lot of focus into the Shadow Crystal. Saying that they can make something incredible for us if we can find enough of them, establishing that these objects are important enough that it actually makes even Sham question their nihilism, even if only for a bit. As for what the crystals do exactly, in the Dark World it's rather straightforward. Both of them just show you the Light World equivalent of where you are, that being the unused classroom and computer lab respectively. But the more inscrutable part of this is what they do in the Light World, which is one of the few cases of a Dark World object having its own proper use in the Light World, in the form of a shard of glass. And may even be debated if this actually is a shard of glass, given that the Light World adds a but at the end, as if the narration isn't even sure of itself about that. Regardless, in Chapter 1, looking through the glass has Chris see through their hand, and in Chapter 2, it shows Susie glaring at them coldly when she's actually just smiling and making a rude gesture towards them. While the Dark World made the function of these crystals straightforward in that it showed a peek of the layer above, if the Light World is to be following this logic, then it's a lot more difficult to really gauge what we're peeking into here. That is, if that's what the crystals are even doing. There's a really good video by Weasel W about the Shadow Crystals that I'd like to use as a sorta jumping off point here, and that I'll be linking either in a card or in a description, as to analyze the crystals in a way that really put a lot of the weirder stuff about it into perspective. We know that Spamton found his crystal from the Neo body, a manifestation of Mettaton or Hapstablook's ideal body that got scrapped because it would never come to fruition anyway. We also know that the Shadow Crystals, because of this fact, do seem to enhance the secret boss's abilities, and for Spamton, seems to make him more unhinged after he gains control of the Neo body. Weasel's conclusion with all the observations they made was that the Shadow Crystals, tangibly, are squandered or shattered dreams. This would tie together its function between both worlds especially. Bringing back the core theme of dreams and Deltarune into this discussion, the Dark Worlds are fictional compared to the Light World, but they're also dream worlds in a way. They take the thoughts of the Lightners and the will of the world's creator and allow those thoughts to manifest in different ways. And given the Deltarune came from a fever dream Toby had, and characters even equate the Dark World to a dream, the shadow crystals in this case may be literally seeing through the dream. They nullify it by showing the reality when looking through it. And as Weasel points out in the video, the Light World still applies to this, as it could be squandering the dreams that Chris might have in relation to their adventures. Their dream of perhaps being their own person and not living in Asriel's shadow, or their dream of growing closer with Susie, each of them being respectively muted upon looking through the glass. And it would explain why Spamton's crystal was found in a Neo body specifically. The crystal is a literal manifestation of Mettaton's dream body being squandered. And for Spamton, I think it would explain why he becomes so unhinged upon having a shadow crystal. Because as a character who is part of the dream, the act of being in possession of a shadow crystal is a self-destructive one if it's by a darkener. He would only see more darkness, only spiraling further in rather than being pulled out of it. Needless to say, you should go check out the video for yourself because it's a pretty damn good take on the whole thing in my opinion. But beyond that, I do think this is the best approximation we have for what the shadow crystals are exactly. And I'll be using this to aid my own theory on what I think they'll culminate into and what purpose they really serve. So bear with me for a moment. There's an unused item in the game known as the Pure Crystal. It's all but confirmed to pretty much be the thing that Sham says they can stitch up for us if we collect enough shadow crystals. The description for the item especially aiding this notion, unless Toby decides to change his mind about it for the full release, which I personally doubt, but it is still a possibility given the crystals were kinda retconned into the game since the 2021 demo. We know that each of the shadow crystals will come from a chapter's secret boss, and we know that we do need all of them in order for Sham to really find the hunt for them useful. You want to know something else about the shadow crystals that's worth noting, that I've also brought up earlier? If you've defeated a secret boss, as long as the file where you defeated them is still present, you can always just get that boss's item and shadow crystal in another location. So far, we can get Jevel's stuff in Castletown, for instance. And on top of that, Sham remembers you defeating Jevel. As I've mentioned before, this is the one thing that the game actually remembers across save files. This is the only thing that actually has some level of persistence between every playthrough, as long as the file where you defeated that boss still exists. And isn't it interesting that it happens to be involving characters who interacted with Gaster directly? As I've already touched on this from the meta perspective in a previous section, I'd like to get to the point. As I'm going to bring up again, there is something Toby has expressed regarding the ending of Deltarune that I think is super important for this discussion. In the FAQ for Deltarune, after he mentions that the game will only have one ending, the next question is, then doesn't that mean that nothing I do matters? Toby responds to this with, there's something more important than reaching the end. Again, this will pop up later, but I believe the first piece to really reaching that thing that's more important than the ending is the shadow crystals. What better way is there to draw the player further into the game's real objective than to send them on a quest to defeat optional bosses to get specific secret items? Not to mention that the next secret boss may very well exist on the same layer as the program that is connecting us to Deltarune in the first place. And the fact that these very items and bosses are the only thing that the game bothers to remember so far between every playthrough. So much so that it lets you collect their items in another location if you've at least defeated them once on some existing file. We also have to think about the purpose of doing this. Obviously, the secret bosses are significantly more difficult, so it would make sense to leave these items in another location for players who already did it and don't want to put up with fighting them again. But the logic behind that is interesting to me. You would have to do this knowing that the players are going to play through the game over again, even after finishing it. And remember what I said about the save files. Aside from Sham remembering secret boss fights from even other save files, there's shit like Asriel's drawer that changes in chapter 1 depending on what slot you pick. And if Gaster was in fact aiding the player in the Spamton Neo fight, this may actually reveal something about his motivations potentially. I believe that Gaster may want the player to go through with this quest. He may actually be expecting the player to go through the game again, on something of a New Game Plus, if you will. Maybe not explicitly that, but the game might be built under the assumption that you are going to replay it, and that on top of that, he'll do what he can to make this journey for the Shadow Crystals possible for the player. There's a chance we may not even be able to get all of the crystals on a first playthrough, for example, but our ability to hop between save files, and also to get secret boss items in another location, may be the key to getting around that. If I am correct about this, then there literally is something more important than reaching the end in this case, because the ending isn't even the actual ending of the game, so to speak. It's just a way to open the door to reach something even more important than that. And maybe that's what Gaster might want. And if you couple this with the potential for more things in the game to change slightly just based on what slot you're in, I think there's a lot of potential for the game to draw you in further by pointing you towards replaying it and using what you already accomplished with the secret bosses to go through the game again, just under a much different context compared to the first time. In essence, the Shadow Crystals are the trailhead to what I believe is Deltarune's true ending, if you want to call it that, and to what I think will eventually be how the game actually handles revealing Gaster as a character. And if they represent shattered dreams, then putting them together into the pure crystal may very well represent the way forward, taking those squandered hopes and times when people gave up and turning them into a pointer towards where you should have been going this whole time. And I think that the pure crystal won't just be useful in the dark world, but in the light world too. If they were originally shards of glass that showed Chris their deepest fears and the ways that their journey could fuck up catastrophically, then maybe when purified, those pieces of glass will turn into something of a magic window. A window that will show Chris exactly what to do to make things right. A window that will lead the player to actually succeeding. Maybe this is why Sham only has any semblance of hope for the Fun Gang if they pursue the Shadow Crystals. Because otherwise, they literally just won't be able to see the correct way to the true ending. And I think to that end, that's the best way that I can address the Shadow Crystals for now. It's the only way to factor them into this larger picture that makes sense so far to me, and I think for being one of many secrets in this game, and one of many things that clearly will relate to, and perhaps even lead us to a proper acknowledgement of Gaster directly, as well as the new future that he wants, it's important to have some idea of what they may culminate into. So with that, I'd like to finally delve into the last few connections to Gaster, or more specifically, the last few secrets regarding him or characters related to him that I feel are worth noting if we want to figure out Gaster as a character. Those being the eggs and the weird root. The eggs don't need too much analysis, but they do relate to Gaster and are worth mentioning in my opinion. For one thing, your way of accessing the rooms with the man behind the tree are very much leaning into the secret and glitch hunting aspect of the game's meta-narrative. Like, finding a secret room by going in between two specific rooms and happening upon it by pure chance definitely echoes some of the fun event shenanigans back in Undertale, specifically the fake hallway and Mystery Man event, so to that end there is already a parallel to draw. But beyond that, there's also the overall glitchy nature of the eggs themselves, appearing in your inventory if you go to the dark world even when you drop them in the light world, and being put in random places with seemingly no real rhyme or reason to what they'll culminate into. If we wanted to also reach, the man behind the tree draws parallels to Gaster thanks to only referring to the man by that word, a man, and one could even make the connection about this and even the tree itself and placing the first egg in Asgore's fridge all having been foreshadowed in the Undertale True Lab, which has some weight to it, I suppose. But the strongest evidence I feel towards this being related to Gaster is how the egg is referenced in one of Noelle's blog posts as a special egg in Cat Pedders. In all caps, by the way, that never hatched, could never be removed, and only left home due to happiness. But on top of that, Noelle was never able to remember the egg's name, a common calling card of Gaster's being the fact that he is just not able to be referred to or remembered by name for whatever reason aside from the Gaster followers. I'm not saying the egg's name was Gaster, of course, but as I touched on before, Noelle and Gaster have a worrying amount of connections to each other, and even if risking confirmation bias, I feel it's worth making this connection regardless. Ultimately, I don't think the eggs will culminate into anything super groundbreaking for the game's meta-narrative. As the description even puts it, they're not too important, but they're also not unimportant. They clearly will have some role and give a bit of insight into things if one were to collect all of them, and I'd say that they probably will be more lighthearted compared to something like collecting the Shadow Crystals, especially given that Temmie is who you end up going to in order to keep track of how many eggs you've collected in the game thus far. Then again, she has gone on record to say that she is scarier than Gaster, and I personally believe her fully, so maybe this is actually Temmie that made the program for us and was talking to us on Twitter the whole time. I mean, Temmie is also 6 letters long. There's a pretty strong case for it if you think about it. But when we talk about the weird root in regards to the egg, this is especially supported because you can't actually get the Chapter 2 egg on the weird root. You're locked out of that completely, meaning that whatever the eggs are supposed to be for, the weird route is going to divert quite a bit from it. Either that, or it just wouldn't fit totally with that route. And speaking of, we should also talk about the weird root in context with this section. There isn't much more to say about it at this point that I haven't already mentioned, but it is in my opinion the most extreme severity of the non-linearity under this meta-narrative. As I've said before, I believe this game is shrouded in secrets, and it makes the weird route an especially interesting case of it, because of who it involves and how it diverts from the main game. Aside from it intentionally being meant to be discovered purely by word of mouth, I feel it plays further into the fact as well that this game is meant to be seen through. What claims to have only one ending and just some secret bosses is hiding a lot more than that and is capable of going much deeper. But it's also interesting because if I feel Gaster is so closely associated with the non-linearity end of this, then how does he feel about the player going through the weird route? Especially when considering that if Rouse was informed by Gaster about the intended order of events, he's shocked to see things turn out differently in the weird route. Well, it's hard to say. You'd think if Gaster were to take issue with it, that he'd do something to prevent the weird route from being possible. Probably not terminating the connection because that would go against the function of the program, but stopping the player in some way. And yet, we're allowed to go through the game and do this route despite that. However, I personally doubt that he is enabling this route either. If you were to look at Deltarune, or the program specifically, as an experiment of his, and the experiment involves observing the player's use of their connection to Deltarune, we have to remember that we're dealing with a scientist here, and the last thing a scientist should do in an experiment is intervene and skew the results. I think to him, this is just one of many trials, one of many outcomes, and he'd rather sit back and see what happens instead of taking any particular stance morally. For all we know, the only thing that really matters to Gaster is that the player just gets to the ending. It doesn't really matter how the player does it, just that they get there in some way or another. And that's the thing about Gaster that is so important and that I really want to touch on here. I've said already that I believe he is this game's Flowey equivalent in terms of his role in the game's meta-narrative, but that doesn't mean that I outright see him as an antagonist the same way that I see Flowey as one. He doesn't have any ill intentions towards the player. I don't believe he's trying to mislead anyone, but he is an awfully curious person. He finds everything interesting. And he wants to see everything through rather than draw any lines for experimentation. Sure, this means that things like the weird route will be allowed, and that's not really the best look. But to cut that off would mean to limit the experiment, and that's against what I think Gaster stands for thematically. I personally think that he'd rather the player be free to explore as much as they want, even if that means breaking things and diverting harshly from the main route in the process in some cases. And besides, it's not like that's getting directly in the way of the prophecy itself so far. Chris still does what they do at the very end of the chapter, and we can still collect the shadow crystals on the weird route. Which again, if I think there's anything that Gaster is encouraging, then that would have to be the collection of the shadow crystals. That probably would matter more to him than anything else if I had to make any guesses. Of course, this very well could change later in the game when the next chapters roll around, but as it is, I think that as long as you are moving forward towards that new future, Gaster isn't concerned about the means in which you do so. That, and especially because you can just have the weird route on one save file for now and do a normal route on another, and the shadow crystals may gear up to be something that warrants multiple playthroughs anyway, this might honestly just not concern him for all I know. And given the fact that the Twisted Sword exists, and currently is only possible to make on an aborted weird route by not giving the Thorn Ring to Noelle, if this stays the case, and we need to abort a weird route in order to make the Twisted Sword and put the pure crystal to good use, this may very well be another step towards approaching this game's potential true objective. He may not enable the weird route itself, but he's okay with letting it happen for science's sake, and also because it may be a way to get the player to accomplish his overall goal with Deltarune's world. And with all of that said, now that I've addressed these two things, I want to lead into Noelle. She seems incredibly important to Gaster. She's one of the 3 characters that he notes as being very, very wonderful, and there are several connections between him and Noelle that I've already gone over. And I find this especially notable because of the fact that she is a known glitch hunter, a hobby that lines up very closely with how the player comes across things related to Gaster in the first place. If it's not glitches, then it's some form of hunting for secrets or poking around where you're not supposed to. The Ice Palace blog post especially stands out in this regard, in how she managed to find a secret door in Dragon Blazers that shouldn't be possible to find, that can't be opened by any key in the game, in a maze that the devs claim is just one of the bad guys' magic spells if you go in without a certain character in the party. A kind of thing that very well feels like something that we may encounter later in Deltarune, especially given the game already has used Dragon Blazers to allude to itself on multiple occasions. But of course, there's also the particular connection that Noelle has to Spamton, and how she views some of it as nostalgic, Spamton's connections to Gaster already being clear as day. And with all of this put together, it becomes obvious that something is up with Noelle in relation to Gaster especially. Particularly when, with all of this in mind, we consider her account of a certain event that occurred behind the cemetery, in which she blinks out on something that must have happened to her, involving the bunker. There's something I'd like to propose now with this information all being presented. Under the likely assumption that the person behind the unused script is Des, this suddenly brings a whole new slew of implications. Because I'd like to note something else about Noelle's blog that might be important. From what I could tell, Des is never mentioned on any of her blog posts. At least, certainly not by name. Maybe she's alluded to in the Blue Circle post when Noelle mentions how she checks spam mail in case it's someone real, and in which case that had to have taken place after Des's disappearance, and while Noelle was searching for her ad nauseum online, but not even in the Ice Palace post is Des mentioned, where Noelle's mom is mentioned at least. And that appeared to be one of the earlier experiences that she had with finding glitches and secrets in games. I can't confirm completely that this is the case, but it would be incredibly fitting, if not horribly ironic, if Noelle's uncanny ability to look for secrets and glitches is perhaps some side effect of Des's disappearance. Attempts by someone to reach out and speak through the darkness, to get anyone to listen and find them, and to manifest that desire in the form of secrets and glitches in video games that people like Noelle can't help but be drawn towards. I can't think of a better way for all of this to line up personally. Having her own sister's disappearance literally haunt her, even through the game she plays in an attempt to escape from the trauma of it. And with everything that I've gone over, the secret bosses, the connections between Gaster and Dark Worlds in general, the shadow crystals, the weird route, and Des's disappearance having something to do with Noelle's ties to the philosophy behind going about the more obscure aspects of Deltarune, I think this all lays out enough evidence, to me at least, to question if this game really will have only one ending. I think the game will have just one ending going by the main route, and if we were to go by the assumption that an ending here means going all the way from chapter 1 to whatever the last chapter is. There's a chance the weird route will alter it, and honestly I'd be kind of surprised if it doesn't, but the shadow crystals especially feel like the trail ahead to something else entirely. A different ending, but not in the conventional sense. Not by getting from point A to point B, but by finding the right pocket to veer completely off the road altogether. And I think the shadow crystals especially will be a way to figure out what that pocket is supposed to be, along with using the 3 save slots and the nature of Deltarune as a program in more creative ways. There is something more important than reaching the end, and I think we're supposed to take that not just metaphorically, but literally too. There's something along the way in the middle of the game that is, in my opinion, the real goal of Deltarune, that being to find Des. I don't know yet how it'll take us there, but I'm certain that is the culmination of all the secrets that this game has for us. And for some reason, every time, no matter what way I put these secrets together, I keep feeling like Des is at the center of all of them. But having gone over all of that, I think I'd like to actually bring us back down to ground level for a moment. I feel like we've been kinda bouncing off of a ton of different topics and analyzing so much shit related to Gaster that it can be hard to really keep track of it all. He's an incredibly esoteric character who warrants analysis through many different ways other than directly analyzing him like we could with other characters. And after a certain point, the question has to be asked, what's this all really boiling down to? Who actually is Gaster anyway? What can we learn about him now as a character, and in regards to his motivations with everything I've discussed? Well, I do have to admit something. Even after all of this analysis about stuff relating to Gaster, I still can't get a good grasp of his character yet. It feels like there's simply just too much left out still to build a profile of him in the same way that I could build a profile for someone like Des, or any other character for that matter. But I think I can gauge at least a theme and profile for him, not necessarily as a character in the normal sense, but as a concept. We have to think about what Gaster is currently. He's no singular piece or whole being. He is a scattered presence that is everywhere and nowhere. And any given piece of him might give us a clue as to what kind of character he is, but not enough to confidently gauge his personality or his aspirations and motives. But he does represent something in the meta-narrative that I feel is essential to it. Curiosity. Looking for secrets, experimenting with a game in a fictional world beyond its limits. An endless desire for more, rooted in a feeling that there is something else to find, though we just haven't looked hard enough for it yet. This is his field of expertise. It's his science. Much like how for many players, it's what they specialize in. It's what they data mine and manipulate files for. It's what they perform glitches and exploits in pursuit of. It's what they make videos and entire fucking blogs about. To me, Gaster and secret hunting are synonymous. There is a character in the game who embodies someone just as curious as some players would be, and who ends up being just as enthralled in the mystery surrounding him, and looking for his sister just so happens to be linked to this very act of looking for secrets, and maybe the key to actually completing Deltarune for all we know. That's how deeply embedded this theme of curiosity is. Flowey worked so well in Undertale because he was the game's way of keeping you immersed even when you were sure you were entirely detached from the experience. Because guess what? They have a character that embodies that exact concept and has done the same shit you did. And now because of that, the act of being emotionally detached from Undertale is acknowledged as a core part of the game's narrative and benefits itself from that detachment. And Gaster in Deltarune is the game's way of keeping you immersed by enabling that secret hunter in you. By acknowledging the over-attachment to it, by continuing to enable this constant desire for more. Because Gaster too wants more. He wants more out of Deltarune's world. He wants a new future in the first place, and that's why he brought you along. This meta-narrative works so fucking well because he has the same motivation to go through this experience that you do, before you even knew of its existence. He knows that you've been looking for him, just as he's been looking for you too. That's why Gaster works so well as a character, even with the absolute bare minimum that we have about him. He was so committed to the bit that he became the bit itself. It's because of that I feel he is perfect as a vehicle for this game's themes, and everything that connects back to him only seems to double down on this theme that he represents, of freedom. Let's backtrack to when he was shattered across time and space. I believe this came as a result of him going too far with Dark Worlds, perhaps something like opening a fountain within a fountain, or doing that enough times to where he had suspended himself too far and now only exists as a vague presence. I find this to be equivalent to being shunted out of the Light World layer, or in this case just Undertale's world, and sent to the Program layer, the space between worlds as I call it. Because he was sent out of it, I believe this would lead him to the realization that Undertale is simply fictional. He sees the code, he sees the programming behind everything, the real meaning behind saving and loading and resetting. He sees that it's all just fake. He sees it almost like the player does. And he may become aware that there is a player of some sort. Maybe not by that name, but he sees that there's some higher force at play. This would have huge implications to him and to the theme that I believe he embodies, something that Undertale never touched on, but that Gaster would be plagued by. The fact that his freedom doesn't truly exist in Undertale. It's not real, and that he never had actual freedom to begin with. Sure, there were alternate routes and all these endless outcomes, but something had to make that world. Something laid the tracks out for them. There was no instance where these characters weren't programmed to do something, scripted to act a specific way. There was only ever an illusion of such a thing. It's not too far off from what Flowey realized after exhausting every possible outcome, but for Gaster it's different in that he just sees it. He sees it all at once, and he doesn't get to keep the attachment that Flowey at least was able to lose gradually. It's all ripped away from Gaster in one fell swoop. But, and I'm not sure how yet, but upon seeing Deltarune's world, and the things that happen in it, and deaths disappearing, and the eventual fate that would fall upon it, of the world being covered in darkness, I think something clicks in him. He stops being bummed out about his circumstances, and unlike Flowey, where he just became completely apathetic eventually, and adopted the kill or be killed mentality, I think where he represented the way that fading emotional investment affects a fictional world, Gaster represents a case of someone who becomes way too invested emotionally in a fictional world. So much so that Gaster himself grows attached to Deltarune. He becomes enamored with that game's world. He wants a new future for it. He's so attached to this specific world that he wants to alter the events of its story. He becomes so attached even that it reflects in some of the fun events. The clam girl talking about Susie and how the time to meet her is fast approaching. The several phone calls that seem weirdly in and out of place at the same time. The different Icy cross route, even though for all we know, Icy probably doesn't even exist in the underground. In any case, he starts leaving pieces of Deltarune in Undertale. He becomes interested in Chris and Susie and Noelle and what they're going through. He thinks they are wonderful characters and he wants them to see something better than what they have currently coming their way. Or, at the very least, just something different. Yet, he knows that he can't do it alone, and it's going to be difficult to change that. But it's here that he remembers someone. The player. I believe that the fun events were a way for Gaster to take advantage of him existing beyond resets and the core mechanics of Undertale to throw some bones the player's way. By this point, he knows the player is, like himself, curious, always wanting to know more about something. After all, that's why he is in his current situation. And just about all of the fun events, if they don't reference Gaster, could very well reference something about Deltarune. I think it was his way of not only seeing if the player could find him, but if the player was interested in Deltarune at all. I mean, the game is even advertised as something that you can play after Undertale. In a way, Deltarune was built with an Undertale player's curiosity in mind. And I believe it's through this that Gaster creates the program that is Deltarune as an executable. Using the feedback he got from the fun events, he wants to take the player's suspension of disbelief, knowing that the player sees it all as fictional, and channel it into a diegetic connection to Deltarune. He realizes there's no better variable for change than allowing a higher force to just appear in Deltarune's world and do whatever the hell it wants. He wants to take this world that was otherwise sent on one linear path and introduce more freedom to it. Hell, why do you think it's even called Deltarune? Delta is a symbol for change, and a rune can mean many things, but here specifically can refer to a type of stone or object with a runish inscription on it. That object being perhaps a device made for the very purpose of provoking change. Literally, a delta rune. This next experiment does indeed seem very, very interesting. Because aside from introducing more freedom, this is an experiment about the player especially. The player carries the fate of the world, and he sees the potential to examine the dynamic between the player and protagonist. And he wants to see how far the suspension of disbelief can go. For one thing, everything related to him you have to divert from the main story for, and the secret bosses so far relate a lot to themes of freedom, and how they each attain or attempt to attain it after seeing things the way that Gaster does. Compared to Undertale, you have 3 save slots and not just 1. You're able to make your own thrash machine that's carried over between chapters. The Dark World in general accommodates your existence and gives you all of these choices, barring Susie sometimes overriding them, but there's so much more freedom and encouragement to just explore the game. Gaster even lets the player make a vessel at the beginning, lets them shape the vessel to their will, give it their own name, and maybe even joke a bit about how, of course, the player sees themselves in this character. But, of course, amidst this attempt for more freedom in Deltarune, it's all discarded. See, there's one more thing I've been leaving out of this section. The fact that, despite all of these choices, non-linearity is only one end of the meta-narrative. And despite being so close to making your own vessel to project onto, in a sudden tonal shift that, compared to everything else I've said about Gaster, seems weirdly out of character, it's instead discarded, and you're shunted to take control of Chris for the rest of the game. There's a lot of debate about this specific section, more specifically on if the character that discarded the vessel was Gaster or someone else. And for the purpose of this series, I'm going to take a firm stance and say that No, this was not Gaster that interrupted the Goner Maker. This is a second voice. And it's not just because of the immediate change in typer value. I know that it changing from 666 to 2 doesn't really indicate a change in character inherently. Suzy uses it, for instance, not too long after. And it's not just because of the fact that the Japanese translation of this scene speaks a lot more like Kara than it does like Gaster. Not confirming that this is Kara, but in any case, it certainly doesn't write like Gaster does. To me, it's a much simpler reason. And this sounds like a petty one, but I really mean it. If this was also Gaster, why the fuck is this not also in all caps? No, really, why? If this was also him, it would have gone just as, if not even more raw in all caps compared to normal casing. It doesn't even take on the same glowing appearance that Gaster's text has. This alone, to any average player, I feel would have to register as, oh, someone just cut Gaster off. I don't know who, but someone didn't want him to give us this vessel. And I know some of you are gonna bring up the fact that Sans does the same thing in Undertale, you to be dead where you stand, etc. But here's the thing, you are not going to take a fucking sentence like that seriously if it were written in Comic Sans. Furthermore, we know that Sans says that anyway because he's literally right there. He's in the frame, his character portrait still shows up. And we don't have either of those things for Gaster. If both voices were really him, then this change in casing seems utterly useless to do in my opinion. Its only purpose ends up being to just spawn a pointless debate about if it's him or not. And I know Toby is no stranger to red herrings. Look at the end of Chapter 1, or hell, even the intro cutscene to Undertale where players are meant to confuse Kara for Frisk in that intro cutscene. But I just don't see why trying to cast doubt on if the second voice is Gaster would be beneficial to the story if the second voice is just Gaster anyway. The Undertale intro cutscene worked because players who are going in blind aren't going to know who Kara is. They don't know that the human there is a different human from the one they're playing as. That, and because Kara ends up being such a drastically unique character from Frisk, with their own baggage that ends up entirely recontextualizing bits of the intro. But we know Gaster exists. There's little reason to imply that it isn't him if it actually is him, and we already know who the first voice is. And honestly, if it were the case, then I don't think just allowing him to be easily identified as the second voice would really give that much away. If anything, wouldn't that actually help further the mysterious nature of him by making the player really think about his motivations more? Is he stupid? This sudden switch-up can only tell the player either, oh shit, someone cut Gaster off, or wait, Gaster doesn't actually want me to use the vessel? Why? What is he actually getting at then? And to me, the way this was written feels more like the former, and I don't think it can say both at once because it makes no fucking sense to say both at once. Just pick one or the other. Or else you're going to muddy up the actual message behind this scene, which I think would really suck for what's effectively supposed to be this game's kill or be killed moment, no? Imagine if when you got hit by the friendliness pellets in Undertale, Flowey just disappears and a disembodied voice starts speaking in a whole other font, saying what Flowey says at that part before Toriel stops him, only to then learn that was just Flowey anyway. Like, fucking what? By process of elimination, I can't see how this can come across more like the latter of the two. If it really were the latter, then just keep using all caps and establish that, yes, this is in fact still Gaster. The scene would be good enough of a red herring as is, and it would still serve the purpose of keeping his motivations vague because of the conflicting nature of that scene. Does Gaster want me to have free choices or not? What is the point of doing two red herrings at once if just one already works well enough? My point is, this change in casing is way too intentional for me to take it as anything other than a second voice interrupting him at the last possible second. Hey, so, before I go any further with this is where I have to make my one and only substantial addendum to this script after my original completion of it. It will be a bit of a tangent into another topic, as I don't know where else to fit this in, but I will wrap back around to the second voice with this, and it's something I was originally intending on leaving out, and even said I would leave out in a couple places at first. But after giving it more thought, I've realized that including it may only really be a good thing rather than a bad one. Let's go back to a little bit earlier this year. Just some hours before Valentine's Day of 2024, an issue of the Undertale Deltarune newsletter released that was, well, themed around Valentine's Day. We got to see Spamton v. Spamton again. And there was some unsurprising but ultimately pretty nice news and a few other cool tidbits here and there. However, at the beginning of it, everyone got 3 Valentine's cards from the characters of Undertale and Deltarune, which were randomized for everyone that got them. From what I know, there were exactly 44 cards that people could have gotten, and one of them was a rather long letter from a certain unknown character. It's a strange letter. It's more or less completely illegible, but if you squint your eyes and you squint your heart, for some reason you feel you could understand it. Well, Happy New Year. Or was it the old year? Well, in any case, how is Deltarune? As you are waiting patiently, the time is going around. There was even a rumor of Valentine's Day. How absurd. Every day is a day of love, if only you believe it so. Do you believe it so? So, the purpose of the message. I want to help. Yes, there was someone I wanted to help. I seem to have forgotten who. Yes, it's quite ironic, but I seem to have forgotten. Was it myself? No. Well, perhaps. Regardless, when I see them, I'm certain I will know it straight away. I never forget someone I don't remember. Will you help me? You are very odd for responding out loud to a letter, but you seem reliable. I will be counting on you. Now, put on your coat and wash your face. Or, put on your face and wash your coat. Not necessarily in that order, or in any order at all. Goodbye. There was a sound like something walking away, and the letter was gone. If you go to the link that this letter originally was found on, you'll now be met with just a completely blank letter with only the border. However, there is a Wayback Archive link to verify that this is indeed a real letter, and just in case you want to read it for yourself. Now, I initially had been going back and forth about this letter a ton. It completely blindsided me, as it did the general fandom as of writing this, and I believe it was written to purposefully do so, mainly in regards to trying to figure out who exactly wrote this. As usual with anything that seems Gaster related, it's just labeled as an unknown letter. There's no direct label for who wrote it. And pulling up the traits that I have commonly associated with Gaster, there are a lot of things here that line up with him. The line breaks in somewhat fragmented speech, the all caps in general, the acknowledgement of Deltarune as a program and acknowledging how time is passing in our own reality, the letter being described as strange and having an illegible handwriting that you could only understand if you squint your heart. It fucking disappearing after people found it. There is Gaster DNA all over this. And yet, while Gaster does have a sort of whimsy tone to him, it seems to be amplified in this letter. It's unusually informal, and even if we just chalk that up to the fact that writing a Valentine's letter is a much less formal context than engaging in a whole-ass experiment, there's still the fact that the speaker seems a bit confused, scatterbrained, asking for our help and being suddenly jovial compared to Gaster otherwise being a bit more toned down with his responses. And when we consider that the sweepstakes was teasing another character that was speaking in all caps and who we could assume to be a future secret boss, it ends up making 2 camps here. One where the letter was written by Gaster, and another where it was written by someone like Friend, or hell, I've even seen mentions of this being written by the man behind the tree, given the appearance of these more conflicting statements. New Year versus Old Year, unsure if he was forgetting about himself or someone else and the like. Sort of echoing this in-between mentality, being not too important, but not too unimportant. So, as I've said, and as I hope is clear as to why, I've been going back and forth on this a lot. Every time I think I'm convinced that this is written by one character, I see fuel for this being written by someone else. But the general debate that I've seen this boil down to is if this is or isn't written by Gaster. I have my own personal feelings about it, but I'm gonna decide to not go too into that here. Because the thing is, regardless of who wrote this letter, I think in any case, it damn near confirms parts of the device theory and my personal views on the game itself. If Gaster wrote this, then we not only finally have a more concrete idea of his character and what he's like outside of conducting experiments, but we also have a more thorough insight as to his motivations for making Deltarune as the program. In this context, while he doesn't remember who he wants to help, he is making the program because he wants to help someone. And given that this would be his actual motivation in this case, this may be a point in favor of what I believe to be the game's ultimate goal of finding Des. I already had this thought that maybe he is making this program to alter the future by helping someone in particular. But if Gaster wrote this himself, then it just flat out confirms that this is indeed what he's aiming on doing. Given how important Des is to the Lightners, and how Des seems to exist on the same layer as Gaster, this would all check out in my opinion. Or, if he's not trying to help Des specifically, maybe this gives us insight into why Noelle in particular is dealing with so many Gaster shenanigans. Maybe he's trying to help her find Des if I had to speculate, and it would even be a point in favor of the theory that Noelle's ability to look for glitches came as a result of Des's disappearance. They're pointers that are trying to tell Noelle to keep searching for her, that she just hasn't looked hard enough yet. Whatever it is, this motivation would more than likely line up with what I already predicted regarding Gaster's end goal in all of this. It's a bit shaky, because I doubt that Gaster would have a hard time remembering someone like Noelle when she's one of the 3 characters that he calls particularly wonderful in the Goner Maker, but I still think it's worth considering. And even if that's not the case, if this is showing a completely new side to his character, and one with more actual depth, showing him to be his own person and not just a vague concept of something, then this even further supports my belief of what he represents in the game's meta-narrative. With what little of his personality that we see in the Goner Maker, we can tell that he's an incredibly curious person. He finds everything the player does super interesting. He has great investment in the world of this game and in the player, and I think that's reflected even more in this letter. Him asking about Deltarune, having this unique perspective on Valentine's Day and how absurd it is, and time passing in our reality in general. Asking these questions in regards to what or who he forgot, even commenting on the reader responding out loud to the letter and calling it very odd. I think he's always had some element of whimsy to him, but if this is written by Gaster, it shows how in a more informal context, that's just how he is. And I think for what he represents in the game, that is incredibly fitting, and if it is giving us a better look at his more specific motivations beyond wanting to create a new future, I think it lines up perfectly with what I already believe the game is trying to steer us towards. But, on the other hand, if this is not written by Gaster, but rather by someone else, whether that be Friend or the man behind the tree or what have you, this still is a bombshell in favor of my theory, and perhaps even more so than if Gaster wrote it. Because it would confirm the fact that there is another character, at least one out there, who is able to say the game exactly as Gaster does, referring to Deltarune as the fictional work, the program. It straight up confirms that yes, this program does exist as a tangible object in the game. It is something that other characters can become potentially aware of and comment on directly. If Friend wrote this letter, then it would explain why Sean would see Friend as an impossible character to win against. Because again, we would be dealing with someone who sees the game the same way we do, and may know it even better than we do, and can take advantage of that. And even if it's not Friend, again, it being anyone other than Gaster would still confirm that the program, the game as an executable, exists diegetically in this story. And that alone is extremely useful information. While I can't give a solid answer currently on who I think wrote the letter, I can tell you this much. Regardless of whether Gaster wrote this letter or not, I think it's a win-win for this theory and this series in general. If Gaster wrote it, then that's just more material for me to narrow down his motivations and general character with, and the picture it paints lines up strikingly well with what I already had assumed of him beforehand. And if it isn't written by him, then it would confirm that Deltarune, as a program, does exist as a tangible object in the game. And if it's written by Friend specifically, then it explains why he's referred to in all caps in the files, and in any case shows that characters are capable of acknowledging the game as the program, the same way that Gaster sees it. I think it confirms that this is something that matters to the story. Either way, this letter is starting to make me think that maybe I was right on the fucking Cromer with this one. And I could still be wrong, but from what I can tell, this letter is extremely in favor of my own interpretations of this game so far. And to wrap back around to the second voice in the Goner Maker, if Gaster did write this letter, then this would just be even more evidence against the second voice also being Gaster. Just assuming that he wrote this letter, look at how it's written. Again, he has always had this hint of whimsy to how he speaks in Deltarune, especially so far. And for him to just suddenly say something as cold as, "You can't choose who you are in this world," it just seems out of character in my opinion. Because doesn't he have a great interest in the player's choices and what they do? Wouldn't he be saying that he is counting on the player's input? Why would he discard the player's choices in the same breath in which he expresses an interest for those exact choices? From what I can tell, what he says in the Goner Maker feels sincere. And with the context of this letter, again, assuming this was written by him, I think it completely shuts down any chance of the second voice being Gaster in my opinion. But even without this letter, I am still pretty damn certain of the second voice being another character. Which, with that established, obviously leads us to the next question. If this is a second voice, then who is it exactly? Well, we currently don't know much of anything about them. But if Gaster was on the non-linearity part of this meta-narrative, I believe that the second voice is on the linearity end. It saw that Gaster was about to have the player be introduced through a vessel and put a stop to that before he could go any further. And I believe the only quote from the second voice that's really worth noting is how it says that you cannot choose who you are in this world. This character is the thing enforcing the linearity in Deltarune's world. It can't stop the player being connected to it, but it's going to do what it can to keep it in check and to keep the story going as it's supposed to. And I believe this character is the reason Gaster became so invested in giving Deltarune a new future. Or rather, it's the main thing that's been standing in the way of that goal. See, we have to consider why exactly Gaster was so invested in this game's world. What is his experiment with it to begin with? Why does he need the player to be involved? Why did he make an entire program to connect us to this world? We know it's because he's trying to introduce more freedom and create a new future, but if there's a force that's stopping that, then that's a force that's getting in the way of it, and one that needs another force of a similar level of power to deal with. Gaster's main motivation, and the thing that he feels will give this world a new future, is